Hello, I'm Jeff, and today I'm going to make a charcuterie board out of maple. I have a friend of mine whose nickname is Mermaid, and she asked me if I could make her a mermaid charcuterie board. So the first thing I did was get on to Crafted Elements, checked out their website. Sure enough, they have a template for a charcuterie board. I showed it to Mermaid. She was very happy with it. So here we go. Okay, and now I've taken the board over to the miter saw, where I'm going to cut it at about 40 inches. The finished size of the board is going to be, or the charcuterie board is going to be 18 inches, but I'll leave it a little extra long, and then I'll trim that down after I clamp and glue it together. There's a large knot at the end of the board, so I'm going to trim that off right now. I left a little extra on the end of the 40 inches to trim that off. And there's the knot. And now I'm going to cut it down to the 20 inches that I need so that I can glue the two boards up. Okay, and now it's time to glue up the two halves with some Type-On 3 wood glue. I use Type-On 3 wood glue because, number one, it's waterproof, and number two, it's food safe, which makes it the perfect choice for cutting boards and charcuterie boards. I apply an ample amount of wood glue to the edge of the board. You don't want to go crazy with it, but you want to make sure you've got it very well covered so you get some good glue squeeze out. Then, using a small brush, I spread the glue out, making sure that I cover all of the surface of the edge of the board. This is a straightforward and very simple process. And now it's time to clamp the boards together. You want to make sure that the boards are nice and flat. I press down on these with my hand while I'm tightening. And you want to tighten them to where they're pretty snug, but you don't want to over tighten. You just want to get a nice little glue squeeze out, and that's good enough. I added a couple more clamps, and that should do it. This is my 22 by 44 inch jet drum sander. It cost me a little bit of money. Maybe not something a beginner would want to get in their shop, but they make smaller units. It's been a game changer. Saves me a lot of labor and time, especially being that I do a lot of charcuterie boards and cutting boards. I run the board through a few times on each side, and that's it. Ready to be cutting out and final sanding. Before I trace out the template, I need to trim off the bottom so that I've got a nice square bottom for the charcuterie board. And now it's time to trace out the pattern. This is a pattern that I got from Crafted Elements. And here we go. I use a Sharpie I know you might be thinking, well, what about the big black line? But you can sand that off, later. Makes it good when you're using a bandsaw or a jigsaw to find the line. And that's it. Now it's time to cut it out. And with a jigsaw, I'm cutting out the shape of the charcuterie board. I do have a bandsaw. You could use that, but I know that a lot of you don't have a bandsaw, so I figured I would show this with a jigsaw. It can be done either way. After cutting out the shape with a jigsaw, I take the project over to my Grizzly spindle sander and begin to smooth out all the edges and bring them down to the black lines that I traced out originally. Normally I would use a roundover bit to soften the edges. However, with this particular design, there's a V shape in the tail, and I will not allow my router bit to get in there and properly do its job. I'm probably eventually going to have to build a new template and make it a little bit rounded over in that V shape so that I could get a router bit in there. I've actually had to do this with a few templates that I've gotten from Crafted Elements. I'm going to have to do this the old-fashioned way and soften the edges by hand. When sanding charcuterie boards and cutting boards, I use two different sanders. I've got the sheet sander that I use for all the edges. This works better, in my opinion, in the corners and curves and things like that than the disc sander. And then for the faces on both sides, I use the disc sander. Here I am sanding and softening the edges of the charcuterie board with 100 grit sandpaper. Next, I will lay the boards flat and sand the faces on both sides with 100 grit sandpaper. After 100 grit, I will move on to 150 grit and then finish with 220 grit sandpaper. Then I will wet the board down with a wet rag, to pop the grain and raise the grain, and then I will sand again the entire board with 220 grit sandpaper to leave a very silky smooth finish. And now comes the fun part, the finish. I've got my maple charcuterie board all cut out and sanded. I usually use Howard cutting board oil. I buy it by the gallon, and then I put it in these smaller containers and then apply it to the board. And here we go. Want to rub in an ample amount of the oil into the grain. And what I will do is I'll put a second coat. I'll let this sit overnight. And then I'll put a second coat on in the morning after I buff it off. And then after that coat dries overnight, I will put on a third coat and a fourth coat of Howard's Butcher Block conditioner, which has an oil and wax mixture. And after that, it'll be done. And that's all she wrote. I decided to show you the second coat. Sometimes the first coat will raise the grain a little bit in certain spots. So when I do the second coat, especially on the edges, you can feel it. If it's a little rough, like right there, it's a little bit rough, a little bit right there. Everything else looks good, feels good. So those two spots have just a little bit rough. So what I'll do is I'll take some 220 wet and dry sandpaper, and I'll just sand it while it's wet. Just give it a light little sanding just to smooth off that little roughness. Oh yeah, and that makes it perfect. And then I'll wipe this coat off after I let it sit overnight, and then it'll be time for the butcher block conditioner. And that's it.